There is a rule you have followed your entire life without anyone teaching it to you. A rule so old, it has no author, no written form, no single moment of invention. A rule that existed tens of thousands of years before language was sophisticated enough to explain it. And yet, every human society ever documented on every continent, in every era of recorded history, has kept some version of it. The rule about who you may not want. The rule about who is forbidden. How did that rule begin? Not in a courtroom, not in a church, not in a treaty written on stone. It began in the body, in the group, and in the slow, grinding logic of survival. And the story of how it got there, the story of the first rules about sex, is one of the most revealing things we have ever learned about what it means to be human. Start with what you actually were before any of this. A small band, 20, 30, 40 people at most. Everyone in that band has known everyone else since birth. The children who grew up next to you, the siblings who shared your shelter, the adults who fed you when your mother could not. You have been physically close to all of them every day for years. And something remarkable happens in that closeness. Something that researchers now have a name for. You stop seeing them as sexual possibilities. Not because of a law, not because someone told you. Because your body, over millions of years of evolution, learned to treat familiarity as a signal of kinship, and kinship as a reason to look elsewhere. Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermark proposed this idea back in 1891 in his book, The History of Human Marriage, and for decades it was dismissed, underestimated, treated as too simple. Then researchers began paying attention to the Israeli kibbutzim, collective communities where unrelated children were raised together from infancy, sharing sleeping quarters, meals, daily life, the way siblings would. When those children reached adulthood, almost none of them married each other. Out of more than 2,700 marriages recorded across kibbutzim by researchers in the 1970s and 80s, not a single one was between two people who had been raised in the same peer group from early childhood. The aversion was real, it was strong, and it required no rule to enforce it. The body had already decided. This is the first layer of the hidden consensus. Before culture, before language, before anything you would recognize as a social institution, the primate brain had already begun building a wall between desire and familiarity. You feel it too, somewhere in your inheritance, though your life has probably arranged things so that you never had to notice it working. But here is where it gets more complicated. Because the Westermark effect, the biological aversion, only covers the people you grew up with. In a band of 30, that is nearly everyone. And in a band that small, if everyone only avoided the people they were raised beside, the math still does not work for long. Close cousins, half-siblings separated by camp relocations, older relatives who arrived after you had already passed the critical developmental window. The biology alone was not enough. Something else had to emerge. And this is where the question gets genuinely strange. Because what emerged was not just a feeling. It was a category, a concept. The idea of a class of people who are off limits, whether you feel the aversion or not. Anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss spent much of his career arguing that this conceptual leap, the moment a group defines a category of the forbidden, rather than just responding to individual feelings, is the founding act of human culture itself. Not fire, not tools, not language, the rule about sex. In his 1949 work, The Elementary Structures of Kinship, Lévi-Strauss argued that the incest taboo's deepest function was not to prevent biological harm, which early humans could not have understood in genetic terms anyway. Its function was to force a group outward. If your sister is forbidden to you, she must go to another group. And if she goes to another group, that group now has a reason to be your ally rather than your enemy. the prohibition is negative in form. Its consequences are entirely positive. Marry out, Levi-Strauss wrote, or die out. You can feel the truth of that in your bones if you think about what those early lives actually required. A band of 30 people in open landscape, surrounded by predators, dependent on coordinated hunts and shared fire and collective memory. That band could not afford to be alone. It needed other bands. Bands that would share territory in lean years, warn each other of dangers, trade knowledge about water sources and animal movements. And the most reliable way to bind two bands together was not a treaty. It was a person, a daughter given in marriage, a son who moved to live with his wife's family, a human being whose body was now stitched into the fabric of two groups at once, whose children would grow up with relatives on both sides, whose loyalties and obligations extended in both directions. The first rule about sex was also the first treaty, the first diplomacy, the first foreign policy. If you've stayed this far, it's because you sense, probably without being able to name it, that these questions are not really about the past. They are about the structure hiding underneath everything you think you understand about relationships. Subscribe now, because every episode on this channel goes this deep, and what comes next is going to unsettle a few more comfortable assumptions before we're done. And here's where the evidence moves from theory to bone. In 2017, an international team of researchers led by the University of Cambridge and the University of Copenhagen published a study in the journal Science. They had sequenced the genomes of 4 individuals buried at Sunghir, a site in Russia inhabited roughly 34,000 years ago, one of the most extraordinary Upper Paleolithic burial sites ever found. The people buried at Sunghir were accompanied by thousands of ivory beads, carved mammoth tusk jewelry, red ochre, the material evidence of a rich and intentional symbolic life. But what the genomes revealed was even more striking. The individuals buried together were, at most, second cousins, not parents and children, not siblings, not first cousins. The team's conclusion was direct. These people had deliberately constructed a system for finding mates outside their immediate family group. Not by accident, not by circumstance, by design. Martin Sikora, from the Center for Geogenetics in Copenhagen, put it plainly in the published findings. Small family bands must have been interconnecting with larger networks, facilitating the exchange of people between groups in order to maintain diversity. What that means, translated out of academic language, is this. 34,000 years ago, humans were not just avoiding inbreeding by instinct. They were managing it. They had built something, a system, rules, obligations, ceremonies perhaps. The ornamentation at Sunghir, the researchers noted, was extraordinary. Nothing like anything found at Neanderthal sites. The symbolic richness of those burials, they suggested, may itself reflect the complexity of the social agreements that bound these groups together. And the cost of ignoring those agreements was real, even if no one at the time could have explained why in the language of genetics. Small populations that mate within themselves for enough generations accumulate the expression of harmful recessive traits. The evidence for this comes from every study of isolated populations across human history, and it was available in ancient human experience long before anyone could articulate the mechanism. Groups that mixed outlasted groups that did not. The rule did not need to be understood. It only needed to be followed. And groups that found ways to encode it in ceremony, in kinship terminology, in the categories of permissible and forbidden partners, were the groups whose descendants are still here. There is something worth sitting with in that. You live in a world where the rules about sex seem endlessly complicated, endlessly contested, endlessly political, and beneath all of it, beneath the laws and the religious prohibitions and the cultural negotiations, is something far older and far stranger. An invisible architecture assembled by people who could not write it down, could not explain it, may not even have been fully conscious of its logic. They built it anyway, out of the pressure of survival, out of the necessity of alliance, out of a body that already knew, without being told, to feel something different toward the faces it had always known. The first rule about sex was not a prohibition. It was an opening, a reaching outward, a decision made in some form across every human society that has ever been documented, that the group is not enough, that what lies beyond the fire is not only danger, that a person from another band, another family, another world is not just a stranger. They are a possibility. They are the future. What does it tell you then? That this reaching, this ancient impulse to connect across the boundary has never stopped. That it is still, in some form, the engine of every social network you will ever build. Leave your answer below, because that question was already old before anyone thought to ask it.